Yeah. Hello. Welcome back to the afternoon. I'm so excited that you guys came back. I'm so excited that a large amount of you guys came back for what looks like a boring title for some people, but is the most fun geek topic ever, which is best practices in open and reproducible science. So with that, I'm going to get into it because we're going to introduce ourselves. With me is Sejal, and we might advance the slide to talk about what we're going to talk about today. Hello, Daniel. Hi, Taha. Yay. Oh, okay. So I got too excited. So at KCNI, we have So today is day one of what is a very exciting 8-day-long course this year. We added a lot of content. We have a lot to show you. Today I'm going to be talking about reproducible science. We talked this morning about clinical science, but that's going to be followed up by discussions all week about concepts like ethics, concepts like micro and macro scale modeling, connectomics, omics, Bayesian modeling, followed by integration and bringing it all together at the end of the week. And so next slide. Yes. So this morning we heard from Sean Hill about neuroinformatics across scales, and then we heard an amazing lecture from Victor Tang and Brett Jones. I want to remind you that you can hear more from those people, that you can rewatch that content by looking up where you see the title of this slide right now, and by navigating to that earlier session.
Oops, 1 minute. There we go.
Yay.
We're back.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Yay. Okay. So today, me and Sejal will be telling you all about guiding principles and tools for reproducible science. This is all one kind of mega session, but we will try to break it up around 2:30 for a break. So this is us. I'm Erin Dickie. I'm the lead of knowledge and education transfer here at the Krembil Center for Neuroinformatics at the Center for Dictionary Mental Health. You can follow me on Twitter at Erin W. Dickie, and you'll see my GitHub ID is eDickie. You'll be seeing a lot of my GitHub today. And I'm joined by Sejal. Sejal, do you want to tell us something about yourself?
Hi, so my name is Sejal. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Whole Person Modeling at the Krembil Center for Neuroinformatics, and I'll be going with Erin Dickie. Mostly I'm concentrating on some of the R scripting and R markdown, which we'll be using throughout these workshops.
Awesome. Okay. Cool. We also want to give a big thank you to our TAs who are hanging out in the chat. I said Taha already said hello. Hello, Taha. We also have Kevin Kadak, who's helping us out, and the other Kevin Witzak, who will hopefully you will see around and will be a big help in helping us install things. We also want to give you help to notice the link below where you see our call to action. That green button is our GitHub repo for the course that we'll be going through a lot throughout today, but we will also that you'll see a lot of it throughout today, so you might want to open it for yourself so you can follow as long as we're navigating and showing you the little bits in it. But we also want to remind you that during Crowdcast, please ask us questions, post interesting information to the chat, because we can see the chat and we're very excited to hear from you. Also, we want to remind you that this content can be rewatched about 5 minutes after the session ends. The video will be posted back at this exact link. And we want to remind you that we have Slack and GatherTown spaces for discussing and for getting more information. And at the end of the session, we'll be posting a call to action link to our post-session survey, where hopefully we'll get information for you about how learning was going and whether or not, and how we can improve the course. Cool. Okay, this one's line at a time. So this is the outline for today. So we're going to start. I'm going to talk about reproducible science and why I'm teaching you reproducible science, just a little bit of theory, and then we'll go into a larger section today, which might we might put the break in the middle of it because it's the largest section, which will be really walking through all of the tools that we use in this course and that are important for you to know about. So we have versioning, publishing code, we have version and publishing software with containers and Docker. And then we're going to walk through some of the systems we use, like R and R Markdown, as well as Python and IPython notebooks. And then we'll also show from those notebooks how you can use Google Colab to look at the same information. And then we'll get into fancy bits after the break, where you might hear about how to build your own binder environment. So how these environments were built. This will be important for those to stick around for, it'll get super fun with fancy install information, but it also give you a little bit more information about exactly how these environments were built if you want to replicate them in some different way along your, if you want to actually read the configuration files and really understand exactly what was installed. Hopefully this information will give you that ability to go into other repos or other workshops or this workshop and figure out exactly how those packages were installed in these different environments, so that you maybe can have help installing these types of things on your home computers. And finally, similar, we'll start with Binder and then we'll move into the container environments. We'll talk about how to write Docker files and how to read Docker files in order to build your own environments. Okay, so I'll start with what and why of reproducible science. So I just wanted to start with a little bit of vocabulary here. This slide is taken from the amazing Turing Way website, which just outlines a lot of the topics we're going to be talking about today. This is just a little bit of terminology here because there's such a thing as these terms tend to be used interchangeably, but they sometimes people can get picky and they mean different things. So sometimes when people say reproducible, they really mean replicable. So they really mean, can you actually get the same result from a different population data set? Today, I'm really just going to talk about that very sadly simple question, which is usually not answered, is if you give me the data, can I even get back to the same result that you got? Can I read your paper and you give me the data and I can actually get back to the same result? That's surprisingly hard to do. And we'll talk about how hard that is to do and some solutions to that. Okay, so reproducible neuroinformatics as a definition in our world, computational science in a scientific publication is not the scholarship itself, it's merely an advertising of the scholarship. So actual scholarship or reproducible scholarship is the complete software development environment and the complete set of instructions that were used to generate the figures. So this is the idea. Reproducible science is about giving all of the information you need to actually regenerate somebody's scientific results. Okay, and we're going to say that it's important for yourself. In the next few slides, I'm going to tell you how it's important for you and your friends, and I'm going to tell you why it's important for science. So we'll start with for yourself. This is like the classic quote. It's still true. Your number one collaborator is yourself 6 months ago, and they do not answer emails. You may think you will remember tomorrow exactly how you installed something or exactly what version of something you installed on your computer, but you will not. If you don't write it down, you will not remember, especially in today's day and age when everything's just getting more complex. My papers tend to have like 10 different stages involved, and I can't remember what I did with them without sometimes rereading the paper or rereading the code. And this becomes really important because everybody needs to do revisions for their paper, which means at some point in the process, they need to go back to step 3 or step 2 in order to actually change the thing the reviewer wants them to change and to move on with their results. The second reason we do reproducible science, and I got to put this to the side so we can read the whole quote. So the second reason we do reproducible science is because I want you guys to think of reproducible science not as this fancy word of reproducible, but as tidy science. So we want things to be tidy because they spark joy. Things that are tidy spark joy. And when things are tidy and when things are organized, that means you can invite guests. In science, this means inviting collaborators. So collaborators can't work from your code unless they can understand it and learn from it and build from it. And this is why it becomes really important to package your code, at least to tell people about what are all the dependencies to code, how to install all the software they need to be able to run your code, to understand exactly what version of the software is so that when that version gets upgraded and everything breaks, they understand what's happening. And if they, so, and how to be able to build from your code. So if they can't understand how a particular step was done, how are they supposed to be able to learn or to contribute to something new or to try to replicate your data in another population? So speaking of trying to replicate and the cause of science, this is one study from Ioannidis, who kind of got popular in COVID days, but earlier got popular for studies like why all scientific results are wrong, or why most scientific results are wrong. He really brought up this idea of the reproducibility crisis in science. And our science is definitely not immune to this type of problem. So this is actually a publication from him in 2009, where he actually took groundbreaking studies, so studies that were published in Nature Genetics in 2005 and 2006. So for those of you who haven't seen Nature Genetics, if you get a publication in Nature Genetics as a graduate student, you will get a job. They will be like life making. So it's very sad that Ioannidis looked at 18 articles in 2005 and 2006 and noticed that over half of them actually couldn't be reproduced. For that reason, the main reason for this was that the data wasn't available, so nobody could actually try to even reproduce. But there was another half where software was unavailable, methods were unclear, or they actually did try to rerun the software with the data and they got a different result 10% of the time, which is pretty sad. So this kind of highlights a problem, and this is specifically in the world of gene expression, which is one area of science that we really care about at the Neuroinformatics Center. So we can think of this as the problem of the scientific paper. We said that the scientific paper is more of an advertising of the science and not actually the reproducible code and data. So I think this kind of explains itself, but the scientific paper is like the two circles example. We tell people two circles and then we told them that we did this amazing result and we show them a figure. And sometimes it's really hard to figure out what happens in between. And this is just another example. I just wanted to highlight that, especially in medicine, we're not immune to this. So this was actually, this is actually a study or something that was published by, I think, Nature Commentary in 2016, which really just polled a bunch of scientists and asked them if they've ever had a problem reproducing a result. And over 50% of them said yes. And it was across all disciplines, including medicine, you can see in the middle there, and biology. Okay, so this paper that I want to show you, this is from Russell Poldrack et al. And this is specifically to my field, neuroimaging research. And this was really a groundbreaking paper for me that told us that tried to talk about the reproducible problems specifically in neuroimaging. And problems and solutions. So there are some things that are just scientific that we'll talk about statistics later, like low statistical flower, causing reproducibility problems, flexibility in the exploration of the data analysis, leading to people just trying things or p-hacking until they get an interesting result and then publishing, and problems of multiple comparisons, which is a big problem in both omics and in neuroimaging. But the two I want to talk about today, Sejal, you can hit down, we should, yeah, are software errors. So none of us are perfect. This is the problem. None of us are perfect. Everybody's going to make a coding error. If you think you haven't made a coding error, that means you're not checking your code. And the only way we can really fix these coding errors is to get more eyes on a piece of code. So they say one solution is to avoid, and the more lines of code you have, the more just statistical probability, the more likely you're going to throw a bug in there. So there's two solutions. One real solution here is that one thing is that we shouldn't code things that we don't need to code. So if a tool is published by a largely well-maintained group, we should be using it instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. The second is that we need to be much more careful and we need to be much more open about the code that we have. The other one, which we're going to talk about, is insufficient study reporting. And the solution to this is actually to try to release code with data and to release that code in a way that is annotated in a way that other people can actually try to run it and read it and learn from it. Okay, so in the second part of the same paper, they talked about what they call the neuroimaging paper of the future, and they expand on what this totally code published version would be. So the first line is that all code and all data collection and analysis would be stored in a version controlled system that would include software tests to detect common problems. And the second line, which is something that I'm not actually going to go into, but hopefully I can build this into later courses, is this idea that repositories should have continuous integration systems. So this is an idea of using GitHub or using other software to actually run the code independently and run a lot of tests to try to catch bugs along the way as you're coding. And the third is that the entire analysis workflow, and we'll talk about this later, should be both successful and failed analysis should be completely automated workflow engine, which will be packaged with a software container or a virtual machine to ensure proper reproducibility. Oh, okay. So we're going to talk about the many bits of a reproducible project. So the important thing to think is that when you have a project, this is also from the Turing Way. I really recommend, if you want to learn more about this, you can check out, they have a whole website book, Land of Happy Reproducible, with lots of pretty pictures. But this one breaks down that when we think about reproducibility, we might only be thinking about one part of our code, maybe just our code or maybe just something, but there's a lot of different areas along the way that go into a scientific project. So there's the data itself and whether or not the data can be published. There's the tools. By this, in neuroimaging, a lot of the time we have pre-processing pipelines and a lot of standard tools that we use. And then there's code, which is actually the code that we put on top of the tools to make everything work, to actually run our analyses. And then we have all these results objects that become part of the scientific project. So first, talking about data, I'm going to talk about there's a concept that we know. I'm going to make sure we can see on the side. There's a concept we see that we hear about a lot called the FAIR data principles. The FAIR data principles, I felt like I needed to speak to. I think we might hear a lot more about them on day 7 of this repo. Dan or Abby can tell me. The FAIR data principles stand for, in this case, not ethical fairness, but more about the reproducibility or the way that data is published. So this came out of a lot of discussions about how to publish data, how to make it available. And they said there were 4 parts of data, the way that data is made available, that make it usable by other people. First is whether or not it's findable, which means whether or not it's actually described or linked to, whether or not you can search anywhere and find it. Accessible means whether or not people can actually download it. So we can say that having something be like data available by request is not as accessible as, say, actually posting it to a repository that someone can download from, or putting it on a website that eventually gets taken down because it's run by an administration. It's run by your own lab, and your lab doesn't have money to maintain the server anymore. Interoperable, and this is important, is about the data type itself. So when people download the data, can they actually work with it? So there's some data types that are very proprietary to a certain statistical language. Like when you want to share a spreadsheet, you could share it as a CSV file, you could share it as an Excel file, or you could share it as an SPSS DAT file. If you share it with some other data types, it might be actually really a lot harder for other people to integrate it into their workflows. So the idea of interoperable is to try to pick the data type that will work for most people. And reusable is about the things we're going to talk about today, about whether or not the data is well described enough that once you give someone the data, they can actually understand it and figure out how to plug it into their own workflow and figure out how to use it and not make assumptions about the data that are wrong. Okay, so in this way, I'm just going to backtrack a bit and tell you a little bit about thinking about the data that you're working with in the lab now. And this actually comes from a while ago when a group of us were trying to come up with recommendations for all CAMH scientists about how they should be thinking about their projects. And the first rule we came up with was organize your data as if you have no memory, because the truth is you have no memory. There's too many things to remember. The second, and this is important, is raw data becomes read-only. In other words, never modify your source data. This is important because this comes in, hopefully this isn't the case for a lot of you, but some people download spreadsheets and then they modify them in place and they don't keep the original. And this becomes a problem when someone gives you a new spreadsheet, which they modified in place and they didn't keep the original, and you can't figure out how to put the two things together. So we can potentially talk at the end about better ideas for version controlling data, but one very simple thing is to not modify your source data. Instead, all modifications to the data should be maintained in your code, and intermediate files should be named as intermediate files. Okay, second one, third rule, this is very simple, is name files for both computers and humans to understand. So there's some rules, I'll talk about data naming, that computers don't like, and there's some rules there's some just general things we can use to make humans understand our files. 3, always know where your data comes from. That kind of goes with 1. 4 is track all the changes that the humans and computers make, and this will come back when we talk about version control. Okay, so naming your data. These are some rules that, once again, are coming from that Turing Way project. These are rules that you don't need to be tech savvy to use. You can just try using them right away. The first is just try to be consistent with yourself. Keep your name short but descriptive. Avoid special characters. This is about making it friendly to the computer. So please actually avoid using spaces in your names, even though some programs will let you. Linux will not like it when they give it to somebody else. You can use capitals and underscores instead to make your names more human readable, to separate words. And try to use consistent date naming. Try to include a version number if possible. And try to find a way to share your naming convention with your collaborators, or record the naming convention as you can in a data management file. Yes. Also, this is very useful. It's very good if things are run in a certain order. Try to add that order at the beginning. Try to make that order work with your naming convention. So sometimes it's useful to pad numbers with 0 and to put 0, 1, step 1 before things go forward in your notebooks. And hopefully you'll see that mostly throughout these slides. Okay, this is my other moment, is that beware the wombat. So this is a quote that I heard at BrainHack in Leipzig, and it stuck with me ever since. So the WOMBAT stands for waste of money, brains, and time. And the WOMBAT occurs when we reinvent the wheel as scientists. So you can click. Do not reinvent the wheel. And I think I have, yes. So 1, if a well-maintained tool or pipeline works for your code, use it. Do not reinvent your own, because you are more likely to put bugs into the code than a large group of users who are all pulling from it and are trying to discover each other's bugs. And 2, and I'll get into this, if there is a standard data naming strategy for the data type you're working with, for the type of project you're working with, use it. Don't try to invent your own data naming strategy. And this might mean that you need to do a little bit of research before you start your study, just to see if there's a classic way to name your data. And in the next slide, I might say, yes. So much groundwork has been made for us. The International Neuroinformatics Coordinating Facility, or INCF, they host a curated list of data standards that we can use in our research. And it's at this link, which I can post to the chat, I think. Or I will link to these slides very soon, so you can grab them. And they actually have this standard. They have this process now for trying to curate data standards. So some standards that they've officially approved and they have links to are the Brain Imaging Data Structure, or BIDS, which is a data standard that I say you definitely should use in all cases for everything neuroimaging and everything EEG at this point. There's also the Neurodata Without Borders strategy for neurophysiology data, and I believe actually Srijoy from our lab contributes to that one. And there's a NeuroML data format for models, which is also now an official standard. Okay, and this is the impact. I just wanted to share why we care about organizing our data so other people can use it and publishing data in a way that other people can use it. So this is actually taken from a paper from Michael Milham on assessing the impact of shared brain imaging data on the scientific literature. So this was published in 2018, which I guess they started writing about 6 years after they, I forget the name of their group, they started publishing neuroimaging data sets. And they published these 4 data sets, which are very exciting. 2, which are still really useful for us, are the ADHD 200, which is a group of resting state data of participants with ADHD. Abide is a sample of resting state data from individuals with autism spectrum disorders and healthy controls. And core is resting state data that's been used for actually testing reproducibility. And they noted in this paper 2 things about the impact of just making that data available. I should say all this data is actually open. Like guys can go start downloading this data now if you really want to and playing around with it. But you can see what it did to actually science and the publication count. So the number of publications that came out of these data sets just bloated exponentially, just grew exponentially year after year after the data was published. And those white bars that you see on the graph on the left is actually the publications that came from the authors that were authored by people who actually helped collect the data. The black bars are people who did not help collect the data, who just downloaded the data externally. And you can see that, so you can look at the white bars as white bars as an example of where science would be if that data did not become published and open and available for people to use. Oh, wait, I wanted to go back and make one more point for that. The other point they did was this table, and this table tries to estimate how much money was saved by the general scientific community because the data was published. So they did kind of a trick, and maybe they're exploiting a bit more, is they took all of those publications and they asked how much money would it take if they had to recollect all of those participants in order to do that study. This is maybe an over-exaggeration because the truth is that some of these studies with analysis never would have happened at all. Just wouldn't have happened because the people who did the studies don't know how to actually talk to clinical samples and how to assess for autism. By the way, assessing for autism is the most expensive part. You can see that it takes about $5,000 to $10,000 per participant. And they looked, because there's been 190 publications, it would have costed, $995 million to actually reassess all those people for the amount of times that data set was published on. We have one question coming forward. Go. So we have one question about how to publish GitHub data so that with your published work. My simplest way to do it is to actually include the GitHub link in the paper. But another example that's very useful is you can, and bring me back to this, you can link your GitHub repo to Zenodo, and Zenodo will actually snapshot a release of your GitHub repo. So it'll give it a DOI and it will essentially give you kind of a frozen release of the data, and it will snapshot it independent of GitHub so that when you're publishing it with your paper, you have the chance that if GitHub ever went down, that snapshot would still be there on Zenodo, and it would be exactly your code as it was when the paper was written. And we'll speak to examples. Actually, this might be the next step. The next slide. Yes. Okay. So publishing all of your code with your paper and publishing all the stages of your research with your paper can be surprisingly difficult just because there's so much code. And there might be a lot of different tools and a lot of different things you used at different points, and those might have changed a little bit as the project was going because it was 2 years long. But So it's actually surprisingly hard, but for baby steps, what we can try to do is at least for baby steps, a simpler thing to try to publish is code for a tutorial, because a tutorial is usually 1 notebook or 2 notebooks long, and has a specific set of software dependencies and was run at a specific time. So we will try to give you throughout this entire course and throughout the next little while examples that you can use as models for how to publish reproducible code and tools. Cool. Okay. So speaking of which, let's go forward and talk about these components of reproducibility as you're going to see them in the course. The first we're going to talk about is GitHub, or Git. So Git is for version control. And version control is a fancy word of controlling the version. So understanding and tracking changes that happen to a folder. Usually it's a folder filled with code. And when it's changed and by who. So we can think about it as the same as MS Word's track changes or Google's track changes or releases, but kind of on steroids, and specifically for code or specifically for text readable things. And with that, and GitHub is a magical place where a bunch of Git repos live and are published. So Git is oh dear. So GitHub has a lot of extra features on top of Git because it hosts Git repos, but it also has a lot of features for working with teams, for reading other people's code, for integrating with other types of platforms, and for hosting documentation websites and wikis and releasing versions of code. So with that, actually, I'm going to share my screen and share the GitHub repo for we have GitHub repo? Cool. Cool. Yay. Cool. So, wait, maybe I'll make it smaller. Is that a good text size? Or maybe I should make it a bit bigger. Okay. So, this is the repo. There's also a link below. Just smash that green button to learn to navigate the repo yourself. But this is the repo where we're hosting all of the tools for the KCNISchool course. There's a couple things I want to show you about this repo. One is its name. It's very useful. But two, we enabled this thing called discussions. So in discussions is a place like Slack, but also there where you can actually post discussions, and I'll try to move a lot of the discussions that happen in this chat and a lot of discussions that are happening in Slack into this area, so they're kind of stored as a permanent question and answer box. We also, that's important. We also have all the code, which is coming. An important part is that this code is still evolving. So some of the code is there. The code for today is there, but code for tomorrow and code for next week will still be added as we go. We also, if you haven't seen, if you scroll down, you can see the README file, which contains a link to all of the lessons, as well as all of the Crowdcast links. So this is where you can click to go back. An important part about README is you can see this little extension .md. So one fun part, so this is what is actually written. So it's written in a format called Markdown with the extension .md. And we actually, in this README, use a lot of tricks to include things like links to different parts of the functions or links to outside places. And you can actually look at the raw version of this to understand a bit more. I also wanted to highlight that GitHub itself is by far potentially one of the nicest README edit or Markdown editing tools. So if you want to learn about this language Markdown, which is the language that both Git uses to display things like this, but also we're going to be talking about Markdown being integrated in our Markdown and our notebook files. You can see it through GitHub. The two other things I wanted to show you is here, releases. So GitHub allows us to use releases. And with this release, we created a release package here, which is actually a release of the code from the 2020 school. So if anyone is looking for the 2020 school, we've now changed this repo completely to reflect code from the 2021 school. But if someone wants to go back to the 2020 school, they can navigate back to it by going to the 2020 tag. And then they'll see what the repo looked like in 2020. You can tell in the 2020 school, the day was 4 days long, and we had a couple different instructors, and we had a different layout. But if we go back to the master branch, we'll get back to the way it is today. What else did I want to talk about? Oh, and one important thing too is you have this big green button. This big green button gives you the link to the GitHub repo that you can copy from when you go to clone things. And a nice thing about GitHub is that it shows you what things have changed. So I just made a change to the repo, and you can see, where can we see the changes? Oh, that can be quick. I'll come back to this. Okay. Cool. Okay. So from there, actually, I think I might go back to the slides. So Sejal. Let's see if I can get them to look here. Oh, yeah. Okay. Cool. Okay, so a reminder of what we saw. We saw discussions to post questions. We saw the code button for help cloning the repo onto the computer. We saw a releases button, which helped us find the 2020 code. And we saw that the README, which is going to be updated constantly as we go, contains information about the schedule of the course and a lot of the links for setting up environments. Okay, so a little bit of a general discussion about GitHub. Before I do this, I can actually ask a little bit. I can ask a poll question about what everyone's experience with Git is. Does everyone see a new poll? Let's see. Ooh. So 2 people who will, ooh, okay. So we have a mix. Nice. So some of you might have not seen Git or GitHub before. Some of you have seen somebody say this a bunch of times, but just sit with me while we do this. So let's talk a little bit about spaces within Git. So we have your files on your computer, and you know that there's a save button, and you make changes and you save that file. There's another space on your computer, which is a hidden directory. And actually at this point, I'll show you. There's a hidden directory called, if you have a Git repo, a hidden directory called .git. And that hidden directory holds information about how files are changing over time. This specifically works for code and text files and anything that it can actually look at and figure out exactly which characters are changing within the file. And then we talked about this magical place, GitHub. So to get from these things from these places and back, there's a few different verbs that Git uses that we hear all the time. So Sejal, you can start pushing buttons. Cool. So to go from your own files to making sure that Git knows about it, this is when we do something called adding and committing files. And then to push, to go from a Git repo, so our computer knows about it, to push that change to the internet, so the internet knows about it or the cloud knows about it, we push the change to GitHub. And then there's this concept of checkout. This is like a magical thing that lets you do time machine-y things. We actually won't go into this, but it's an idea that you can use to revert code back to a certain timestamp. And pulling, which is very important. Pulling is taking data from the internet and putting it on your computer, which is very important if you're not the only one touching your code, or if it's being stored on, if you're working with it on multiple computers, you can use pushing and pulling to synchronize across computers. And there's some other verbs called status, diff, init, and clone that are also used to push and pull things from GitHub. So with that, actually, I'm going to do another demo. And we'll see how this goes. So I'm going to try that. Cool. So I'm going to try sharing my other screen. And I'm going to try on this other screen, opening up Git Bash and then VS Code and modifying what's going on. Git. Cool. Okay, so here's Git Bash. I'm going to go back to the repo. And I'm actually not going to go to this one, but I'm going to go to a different one. We'll show what this is for. Okay. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to clone it to my computer. Everyone see that that's a bit big? Okay. So to get a copy of this repo, this example Python repo on my computer, I'm going to say git clone, and I'm going to grab this guy, hit the copy button, and clone him. Paste. Oh dear. I'm going to try that again. Oh dear. There we go. Okay. So now if I look in this folder, I have a copy of something called example Python repo. If I say git status, it's going to tell me that it's clean because it matches the version that's on the internet. Now I'm going to, can I just do something simple? Oh, I'm going to go into this folder. Now, oh, 1 minute. Okay. You can see there's data. I'm going to do nano. Nano is a simple reader and writer. Cool. And it's going to let me change. This shows me the text that's in the README file of this repo. A lot of things going on here, but I want to add a section to say Erin used slides and link in gold. Paste. Ah, does that work? Yeah. And add the link to the Google Slides for today to the repo. I'm going to exit and save that. Ah, okay. Okay, now we see we have the exact same folder, but if we do git status, we're going to see that we modified the README file. So we can type git add README file. To tell Git that this is a file, this is a change that we want to write something for stash and commit, and git commit. And then we're going to give a message to say, with a message to say added link. Added link to slides. And now that I made that commit, add the link to the slides, it's now saved, it's now changed in my Git repo. Actually, I wanted to say, oh, I wanted people to notice that this as a Git repo exists. Where is it? Oh. So this is a Git repo because there's a hidden folder called Git here. This is how you can tell if something's a Git repo. So you can say git status, and now it'll say that everything's clean, but that there's one commit that hasn't been pushed to the origin. So then we can say git push. And my prompt. And everything will change. All right, we'll see that something got pushed. And then if we look back here, refresh this page, we will notice that at the bottom of here, where'd it go? See a difference? Okay. I don't see the change. Let's see. And we should see it updated on GitHub, and then we'll be able to pull it in. We'll see what happened there. Did I say it didn't work? Yeah, added link to slides. If we click here, it'll say that the most recent change, and then we can actually see this in green means this is a new section that I added. If I deleted something, it'd be in red. And if we look back at the original repo, we'll see now if we scroll to the bottom, now we see the link to the slides in this Python repo. Okay, so that was my demo of Git for anybody who wants to know. Okay, back to the slides. Let's discuss what we discussed. Uh-oh. Yay. Okay. Okay, so to recap what we did, and this is just your basic, this is Git. So step one is either to have your repo. Oh, we didn't show how to make a new repo on GitHub. Actually, that's very simple too. Maybe we'll do it later. But once you have a repo, you want to pull your changes first thing in the morning. Every day, every time something happens, or every time you step away from your computer, it's a good idea to make a commit, because the more often you make a commit, one, the more places you have that you can move backwards to, and two, yeah, essentially that's true. Commits are free, they're magical, and the more chances you have to remind yourself of what you did. And then at the end of the day, you want to git push to move your data back into the cloud. This is why. Next slide. Git, and this is a quote taken from somebody else, I believe Fernando. Git is the toothbrush of science. The more you use it, the better it works. The less you use it, it's disgusting to your friends. Yes. Okay. So speaking of Git with friends, when you're working with friends, when your project gets big enough that you're trying to co-work on something, sometimes just pushing and pulling back to one repo can get very, very, very overwhelming very, very fast. If there's 200 different collaborators, keeping track of what everybody did and making sure that one person's changes work with the other person's changes can get very hairy very fast, which is why there's some fancy other terms that I just want to introduce while we're working. And projects tend to have something called a contributing.md file. Larger projects tend to have something called a contributing.md file, which tries to overlay how to do this. So step one of working with a bigger group is to fork a repo. So fork is a fancy word. We can look at it here now, actually, or I will come back to it. So fork is a fancy word for creating a copy of a repo in your own space. And I'll show you how that works. Two is you create a new branch. So branches, unlike forks, branches are in your same version of your repo. You can almost create another like fork in the commit tree. You can create something called a branch, which essentially labels all the changes that are going to happen to one particular area. So a lot of people create one specific branch. Like I created a branch for this repo called dev 2021, and I try to commit all the changes that I want to do to the summer school code in my branch called dev 2021. And that way it's all labeled as something that's changing for the repo in 2021. In larger areas, sometimes they have specific names they like for this branch. So you name the branch like bug number 1121 to actually reference that branch is a branch where you're fixing a bug where that was an issue 1121. You can look at contributing guides to get examples of these. And then the key is it might take you multiple days or multiple commits to actually do the thing you want to do to the repo. But every time you do, you try to make new commits to the branch where you're doing that. And then once you're done committing the branch, you make something called a pull request, so you push to that branch, you do something called a pull request, which actually gives your collaborators the ability to review your code, and you push that pull request upstream, and then somebody else from your repo can actually read your code before they incorporate it into the code, into the larger project. So I'll show a little bit about this in two ways. I'm going to switch over to me screen sharing again. We'll go back to actually the Krembil School for Neuroinformatics project. So I wanted to show you, and especially anybody else who's contributing to this, that we actually do have a contributing.md file for this project, which outlines with specific code examples, examples of how to contribute and how to do this branching idea that I talked about. So step one, fork the lessons repo. So I already have a fork of the lessons repo. So if I hit fork up here, here's the fork button. It'll tell me you already have a fork right here. Would you like to go to your fork? If I don't have a fork, like say in that Python examples repo, wait, where's Python? If I go here, yes, it asks me, where do you want to fork it to? So this is myself. This is a bunch of my friends and different organizations that I'm part of. I can put the fork in any of these GitHub organizations. I want to put it in my own space. So I click on myself. And then you see, usually you see this really cute little animation of a fork. You might not get that anymore. Yeah. And then you get, if we look in the top right, we have the exact same code base, but it's under my name. And it says right here that it was forked from Krembil Center for Neuroinformatics, the same name of the repo. So the fork is always linked to what's called its upstream copy. Now going back to the contributing guide, so step one was fork. Step one was to make your own copy in your own space. So this means that all the changes you make won't necessarily try to impact somebody else's change, because you might be trying to change bug number 2 and they're trying to change bug number 3, and those things might conflict with each other. 2 is to clone the local forked repository. But 3 is to create a new branch about how you want to develop. And then when you develop in that branch, you create a pull request back to the larger repo. So in pull requests, yeah, if we look at KCNISchool lessons, it actually tells me, or it used to tell me, I might go to my own fork. If I go to my own version of KCNISchool lessons, which is forked from the larger version, yeah, it automatically tells me that I have a branch that's 33 commits ahead of master. Or 33 commits behind master, actually, because Frank just committed a lot to code. So I want to fetch from upstream, fetch and merge, hopefully. This is important because as you're working, other people might have made other changes, and you want to always pull in other people's changes so that what you're trying to commit to the larger repo is the right one. And then we're good. Cool. I thought actually I had made some changes to the repo too. We will see. We might have more. Oh, here's a pull request. Yeah. So I also made some changes earlier today. Oh no, Tasha made some changes. Link to Docker environments readme does not work. That's a problem. Fixed link. Yay. And we can see his changes. So we can see that he changed this link from KCNISchool lessons M's readme to M's readme, which is true. That's what it's supposed to be. And I can review the changes as his collaborator and say, I approve. Let me just scroll down. And then I can merge this pull request, confirm the merge, because I have the powers. And if we look back at the original lessons code, we'll now see that his changes have been pulled into the README file. So that is how we do Git with friends. So moving on from Git, I wanted to speak a bit about Docker. Oh no, first I needed to tell you something about submodules. Okay, so this is a specific issue that we have. Wait for it, yeah. This is a specific issue that is very important for the way that we ran the code here. So a submodule, this is like next level Git. A lot of people don't use this, but in the course we did, so I need to tell you about it. So a Git submodule is one Git repository that's nested inside another Git repository. And it looks like a lot of different things. So yes. So in this way, you can think about the KCNISchool lessons repo, not as one big repository, but as, in some cases, an index or web index of multiple other repos. And this may appear on your computer as two different things. Yeah, so on GitHub, you'll see a submodule actually not as a link, but as a hyperlink to another module at a specific commit version. On your computer, you might see a submodule as a Git repo inside another Git repo. So you should see more files inside another file. And there's two reasons why we do this. One is that within the course, some of the instructors were developing in their own spaces, and then it was a lot easier for me to tell them, just tell me the name of your Git repo and I'll link it to the main repo as an index, than it was to tell them to reorganize everything into our space. And the second reason was that it makes Git a lot faster. So it means that certain lessons, maybe they want to use it for another school, so they want to develop it in their own space. The second reason is that the more files you put in a Git repo at the top Git level, the slower Git gets. And we were noticing that the KCNISchool repo, at least last year, was impossible to download or clone because there were too many files. But we got around this. It becomes a lot faster to clone or for you guys to be able to download because of this submodule structure. So I just want to show you, if I exit out of this, what this looks like on GitHub. So you can see in the day one section especially, we'll talk about why these needed to be submodules, but you can see that both of these are submodules. You can know that because they say new repo at, and then this is actually a specific commit. So if you go to that specific commit, so this is actually important, we'll see this. In the Python repo, you saw me just change it earlier in this lecture. If you click on the link, it links to a specific commit. So it links to the commit before I added the link to the slides. And I can demo how to add the link to the slides back, but we'll look at the code that you need to do that actually right now. Okay. So there's two gotchas that everyone needs to remember as we're working from this because of this submodule system. One is that we need every time we clone the repo, if you're bringing it to your own space, you need to use this recurse submodule flag, or you're not gonna get the changes that exist in those submodule folders. Two is that as we update throughout the week, you're gonna have to keep saying git pull also with that recurse submodules flag so that the changes in submodules are still pulled to your computer. If you didn't do this, never wait is pretty exciting. If you didn't do this, you'll notice that when you try to look on your computer inside the folders that are submodules, they'll look like they're empty. But to fix this, it's actually a two-step just two commands. You just do git submodule init and git submodule update. And with git submodule update, then you'll suddenly see that those folders get populated with all of the files that you need from that submodule. Okay. Okay, we're getting far. Okay, so this is just an example of how submodules are added. For anyone who wants to do it, it seems simple. It's git submodule add, and then you just link to another Git repo. But to update it, you need to say git submodule update and then -- remote. So this is if someone changes the content, like if I want to update that KCNI environment. Okay. That was a lot with Git, but I'm going to move into the excitement of Docker. before the break, and then we might get to take a break and for me to drink some water. Okay, so Docker or containers, why? The reason why we use Docker containers is because code is surprisingly physical, especially to all of the dependencies. So this top part might be your one fancy script in R that you think you're publishing when you're publishing your paper, but you don't realize that that code depends on all of these things that exist on your computer that might be very specific to the way that things were installed on your computer. So there's the version of, in this case, it's an R script, so there's a version of all the Python packages you use, but there's also the version of R, and then there's also the operating system that's underneath that. And if somebody tries to run your fancy R script on their own computer, it could crash. It could produce different errors because it's, or it could crash. It could produce unexpected outputs or errors, or it could run, but it could actually produce the wrong result, which is actually the scariest case. So there's now this entire push towards this idea of reproducibility, which is that we share the code on GitHub, but then we also share on Docker Hub or on in some other way all the reproducible computational environment that was used to run this code, so that the code can run for other people and other people can inspect the software and know what the versions were to figure out what happened. Okay, so there's two types of container engines. There's Singularity and Docker. Both of them are very similar to the concept of a virtual machine, for anyone who's heard of a virtual machine. So it's like this little encapsulated, huge, they call it an image, a large image of all the software that you need to run something. So it tends to be big, but it's a little fancier than a virtual machine or software, because if it's very similar to something else on your machine, it works in layers. So two different software containers can share the same base layer. So for example, if I change something in the day 5 code or the day 6 code and I need to add, say, a new R dependency, downloading the extra R dependency should be very fast because it's only changing the final layer of the Docker container. Okay, this was all fancy, but another important thing about Docker is that Docker containers or Docker specifications can be pushed to something called Docker Hub, which I'll point you to as somewhere to check out a bunch of different Docker ideas. Okay, so the reason why Dockers got popular, or two reasons why Dockers got popular. One was about reproducibility. It's one of the major ways that we can make our code more reproducible is to add these Docker files. But they also allow you to do powerful things in your science. So you can develop and test a Docker container to do some kind of computation that you might want to do on every single file in a large data set. You can test it with a little bit of example data on your local computer, but then when you want to scale up and you want to run that analysis on your entire group, you can convert that Docker container to a Singularity container and you can run it on a high performance cluster. So this means that you can, so without having to develop directly on the high performance cluster, without having to develop everything specifically for a high performance cluster, you can move across multiple different performance clusters. The second way, which is also getting much more popular, is that you can take a Docker container and you can deploy it in the cloud. So somewhere like AWS Web Services or Canada is starting to build its own cloud services. And this is becoming more and more important, especially in health research, where there's some people who are saying that the future of health research will actually be mostly cloud-based if we can get secure cloud services, which a lot of people are working on doing. So the idea is that there's one secure cloud that can host data in a secure way that only people with correct access can get to it. And you might be able to create a different cloud-based application or pre-processing pipeline, and you might be able to connect those two in the cloud. And to do that, you need to write your application for the cloud, so you need to write it in Docker. And then you'll be able to do health research at specific hospital sites, and you'll be able to scale hospital research much more strongly. We had a question about this. It reinstalls all dependencies in each image. Yes. So yeah, so we had two questions here. Yes, or federated learning. Federated learning actually, we'll talk about one. So can Docker images talk to each other? I'd be worried about using Docker would fill up all my storage space if it reinstalls all dependencies in each image. That is true. That is why Dockers have this concept of layers, like onions. They have layers. And we'll talk about this when we talk about building Dockers. So if a Docker script are identical except for one line, and that line happens to be the last line, then those two Docker images should be able to share all the software that was installed in the lines before it on the same computer. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's essentially what it does. Singularity images in comparison actually are just like one huge file that stores all of the data, all of the software. Two things about size is that Docker images a lot of the time are running on cloud services, so you have a decent amount of space usually in that cloud to be able to just add a completely new Docker. And considering there's nothing else in the machine other than that Docker image, you can see that it'd be important. The second thing I wanted to tell you about size is that, yeah, size does become an issue with Docker, which is why Docker images tend to only contain what they need to contain to run a certain computation, which means that if you start with your Docker image, you might notice that certain things that you're used to having on your computer might not be there. And a lot of the trick of building a new Docker image is to realize what are those things that people, when they told you to install, don't imagine that already exists. Don't know if I hope that answered someone's question. Okay. The second thing I wanted to say, Mohammed mentioned federated learning, which is very important and becoming very exciting. So there is a group. This idea of federated learning is that we can push the computation to the hospital instead of trying to bring the hospital data to us. This is potentially a much nicer, a much more ethical way to do, ethical and legal way to do the kind of research that we want to do on big data, is to push our computation to the hospital. And the simplest way to in order to be able to push computation to the hospital, we need to be able to package everything about the computation to the hospital. There's a group that's really working on this in neuroimaging and omics called Enigma. So they've been doing federated learning since federated learning was not cool before it went mainstream. Actually, I don't think it's gone mainstream yet, but they're really trying to push this idea. And so back in the day, they were like literally sending Word documents with lists of bash commands for people to run on their computers and install instructions, and then collecting all the results to federate learning. Now they're building tools, something called like Enigma CoinStack, which is like a program that just accepts Docker containers from developers, so that those containers can run on their data and push intermediates and push results back for federated learning, specifically in health science and psychiatry. Okay, so that being said, like I said, we're trying to make this class be an example of how to work with these tools. So we're trying to give you a bunch of different ways to work with this. So I just talked all about how Docker is exciting. So we're going to try to ask that you do try to install the Docker on your computer and play with it a bit today and use it to actually run the interactive coding environments from our lessons. To do this, you need to locally install Docker Desktop, and these images, some of them might be up to 5 gigs, so you might need about like 15 gigs of space on your computer to make it work. If that doesn't work, either because you can't install Docker Desktop or that's way too much space on your computer, we do have 2 different ways for you to work with the data. These all have some form of containerization behind them as well. So there's Binder, which I'm going to talk about at the end about how we set up Binder environments, but these are kind of like links that when you click on them, they actually spin up a Docker container in the cloud for you to work with. It might take some time to boot up because it needs to build a Docker container in the cloud, but it should work, and it shouldn't take very many resources from your computer. It just might take some time to boot up. The last is to run on a Sinet account. So in this case, I'm going to be converting these Docker containers into Singularity and putting them on Compute Canada. And I can give a limited number of you, or probably as many people as ask me, temporary accounts on the cluster, which means that you'd be connecting to the cluster to run the environment in Singularity, and then interacting with them on the browser on your computer. And I have extended instructions for how to do that. But if you want to do it that way, you need to email me at KCNISchool to ask for instructions, to ask for the temporary account. So for those of you who are going to try the Docker Desktop way, you're going to need to download Docker Desktop. You might also want some other environment you can use as a terminal for pushing and pulling data. So I was using Git Bash in this version. If you have a Mac or a Linux computer, you're already set. Or if you have Windows subsystem for Linux, you're already set. The other things you might want, but are not necessary, because I'll try not to touch them during this tutorial. VS Code, I'm using more and more. I'm really liking it. And GitHub Desktop, officially, I honestly forget all the Git commands, but GitHub Desktop makes all of the Git so much easier for me. So if you like to Git and you think you want to use, and you're getting tired of like Googling Git commands every time you use them, try downloading GitHub Desktop. That's my little plug. So as we're going into the break, I'm gonna tell people you should try installing Docker Desktop. We take a break and seeing if it works, and seeing if you can get to the point where you run Docker run hello world. One gotcha as you install Docker Desktop is that actually there's two gotchas. One is on Windows, you need to enable virtualization. So either Hyper-V or Windows Subsystem for Linux virtualization. This is a largely complicated step. I needed to actually bring my laptop to the system administrators at my hospital to get it done. So it might be a no-brainer. It might be the moment when you give up on Docker. The second thing, which is definitely overcomable, is that you need to share the drive with Docker. We'll talk about sharing drives and mounting drives. But I do it by going to settings, which is the little wheel, and then resources, and then file sharing. And I just share my entire C drive, actually. But you can decide whether to share your whole C drive, or you can decide whether to share only the folders that contain the repos for these lessons. And then once that works, you should be able to run Docker on your local computer. If not, talk to me about Binder or Sinet Teach Cluster. And if that works, you should be able to clone the repo, recurse submodules, type cd KCNISchool lessons, and then type docker compose up RStudio, and then watch a lot of things happen. And then point your browser to localhost 8787. That's where RStudio usually lives. Yes. And that's when you should see RStudio pop up in your browser if everything works magically. I had one question. This is where I'm going to leave it for the break so that I can drink some water and give you guys a chance to try this out. Yeah, so somebody asked, I'm going to upload this. Somebody asked, is virtualization thing the one from the BIOS? And yes, the virtualization or enabling Hyper-V is the one where you need to go into the BIOS of your Windows computer, which is something that scares me that I don't like to do. And I actually needed a systems administrator to let me do it because it's a work machine. So if this is a no-go, then we can try to get you connected to the code in other ways. Awesome. So with that, actually, I'm going to send you guys to the break. Wait. I'm going to send us to the break so I can drink water and we can talk on GatherTown for the next 15 minutes or 15 minutes or actually 30 minutes while we try to get these things started. Awesome. Yes, if you already ran virtual machine or some other type of virtualization software, then you should already have it enabled. And it should be good to run Docker. Yay! Cool.